I'm delighted to welcome Professor Ray Taras to Brigham Young University. Professor Taras is a professor of international relations and director of the World Literature Program at Tulane University in New Orleans. He has, as they say, a CV as long as your arm, and so I won't repeat it all, but he's written about 15 books, most of them having to do with broadly European topics, but he really covers a huge amount of ground. He speaks, in addition to English, French. He's a native of Montreal, Spanish, Russian, and I think having done a PhD in Poland, we can assume Polish as well, right? So he's one of the relatively small handful of people who I think has deep expertise in both what we used to call Western Europe and Eastern Europe. We don't use those terms so much anymore. But relatively few people cover as much ground as he does and have as many interests in as many areas. And so I think of him as kind of someone who's really models that life of the mind, a curiosity, a relentless, restless curiosity about a very large and sprawling continent. He's going to talk to us today about a topic he calls a Europe of Phobias, with the subtitle, How Immigration is Making the EU Paranoid. And so I hope you'll join me in welcoming to BYU Professor Ray Taras.
Thank you very much, Wade. Thank you for the opening prayer. Thank you, Corey, for organizing this event, and it's a real pleasure to be here at BYU, which I think has the makings of being one of the premier international studies programs in the United States. So I'm going to be very cautious in making sure that I use only facts and substantiated opinions and nothing else. What I want to do today is to talk about xenophobia, which is a fear of foreigners. I want to, in particular, look at anti-immigrant attitudes in Europe as an example of xenophobia. And as I reflected on this subject, I realized that religion is very much at the heart of xenophobia in Europe. If you focus on the best known example of xenophobia in Europe at the present time, it's Islamophobia. So it is about a religious belief system. And I want to talk about the role of religion, and in particular of a non-religion, secularism, in the definition of the stranger in Europe, which I think has a lot to do with the rise of xenophobia in Europe. And if I have time, I'd like to, in addition to looking at Islamophobia, also consider Orthodoxophobia. The Eastern Orthodox Church is alive and well in Russia, in Romania, in Greece. At the same time, some of these countries are the least liked in Europe. Could a fear, a dislike, a distancing from the Orthodox faith account for this particular orthodoxophobia? Or xenophobic attitudes in the society can make a country lurch towards illiberal and undemocratic practices. So for political scientists, what's important about xenophobia is intolerance, exclusion, disenfranchisement, discrimination can actually produce a very illiberal state and even an illiberal statist ideology. A lot of political parties in Europe have sprung up in the last few years that emphasize anti-immigrant, anti-stranger orientations. It's one of the main areas of research for, let's say, PhD students in Europe, the rise of right-wing parties throughout Europe. I argue, too, that xenophobia can represent a backlash against Euro elite discourse, which is perceived by many Europeans as privileging the rights of minorities, of immigrants, of asylum seekers, and granting them civil rights without really emphasizing the civic obligations that newcomers to Europe or visible minorities who have been in Europe for quite some time owe the state, civil obligations. For populations that make up the ethnic majority in EU states, the discourse from Brussels appears to emphasize these civic obligations above everything else, and pays little attention, really, to the rights of the majority group, their identity, their dominant language, their lifestyle, and their values. So xenophobia, in short, isn't just about not liking the religion or the color of the skin or the smell of olive oil of a foreigner living in your midst, but it's also a reaction against political correctness and the secularist kind of proselytizing of the EU elites. Negative receptions have been given to immigrants in receiving societies. Italy is, in many ways, a battleground right now. There's been a serious violence between, in particular, Italians and people from Romania, some of whom are not, in fact, Roma, but in the eyes of Italians they are. But there are also important anti-immigrant attitudes that have surfaced and have been aggregated by political parties in Austria, in France, in Germany. Recently, the construction of a major mosque in Cologne has prompted huge protests by Germans. Switzerland, which is not a member of the EU, has a very right-wing anti-immigrant political party whose poster for the last campaign consisted of 4 sheep on the Swiss flag. 3 of the sheep are white, and they're kicking the black one off, which represents more or less the proportions of ethnic Swiss to immigrants, to foreign-born in Switzerland. So today, the increasing power and visibility of ethnic minorities and the supposed accompanying social problems that growing migration has been producing, all of this has raised concerns over what has been described as cultural pollution, over-foreignization, Islamicization, minoritization, and more practical concerns deal with the economic costs of receiving immigrants, the capacity and carrying weight, both economic and environmental, of continuing to absorb large numbers of immigrants. A recent study in Britain found that if immigration rates continue at their present pace, Britain will have to build 7 cities the size of Birmingham to accommodate them. So just if you've been to England, you realize that this is already a country that is fairly congested. It just recently recorded the highest population density rate in Europe, ahead of Holland. So how can you continue to allow people of any kind, if Britain had a high demographic reproduction rate, there would still be very large logistical problems about accommodating so many people. So this is another very important impact of immigration in this case that creates xenophobia. There's a perception of fraudulence of asylum seekers, people not filling in forms for admission into a country honestly. And so for every case that you have a fraudulent asylum-seeking case, it leads to sort of a domino effect of anti-immigrant attitudes. Cultural values are very important in all of this, of course. Immigration remains tinged with cultural and societal identities that correlate more with affective than instrumental evaluations. Primacy of cultural values is particularly pertinent to issues related to identity in a given society that involve maintaining a national identity even as immigrants, asylum seekers, and other groups, longstanding minorities, what I've called faraway locals, people who have been living in a country for quite some time, end up being foreignized. The case of Muslims in France is a good example. Faraway locals in France are people who actually, let's say Muslims from the Maghreb who have lived in France for a generation, maybe even longer. But for the first time ever, they are now treated as foreigners because of a backlash against Islam. So identity, culture, and I would argue religion as well, are defining features in this kind of struggle between maintaining national, historic, traditional identities in European countries and the impact that the arrival of strangers has. Why citizens come to fear and even hate foreigners has been the subject of a lot of research. And one thing I'm not going to do today is to provide any type of statistical data on European attitudes towards foreigners. The Eurobarometer is a good source of that information, but at the same time, a lot of national surveys, for example, Albus in Germany and CBOS in Poland, provide data every year on changing citizen attitudes towards foreigners, whether they continue to welcome them or have begun to take a very hostile view of them. Defining a group as foreign is an insidious act in itself. None of us would like to be considered foreign. If, let's say, we go to New York City and somehow don't seem to fit in, and to be branded as foreign, strangers, is an insidious act that sort of is really an attack on our kind of credibility and sort of qualifications. So branding people as foreigners is already the start of a process that can lead to xenophobia. It resembles what Russian literary critic, writing in about the 1920s, Mikhail Bakhtin, described as official fear, an offshoot of the cosmic fear felt by impotent humanity in the face of nature. So official fear is, I think, very important in helping us understand why so many European citizens now are very wary about foreigners. It is not simply a grassroots sort of a phenomenon, but it is official fear that seems to be orchestrated in many respects from above. Political elites everywhere, including in this country, know the power of spreading fear among their citizens. So European leaders are no different in that regard. Fear of foreigners affects the politics of hospitality offered by a host society to its strangers. French philosopher Jacques Derrida talked about hospitality as contingent in nature. It's circumscribed by a country's legal system, especially the immigration laws. The legal system places limits on the immediate, infinite, unconditional welcoming of the stranger. Conditional hospitality is offered at the owner's place, home, nation, state, city. That is, at a place where one is defined as the master and where unconditional hospitality is really dependent on the magnanimity of the receiving society. In short, the law of hospitality is the law of oikonomia, the law of one's home. Offered as the law of place, legal juridical hospitality lays down the limits of that place and its availability to strangers. It retains the authority over that place, limiting the gift to the stranger that is being offered. In this way, the foreigner is allowed to enter the host space under conditions that are determined by the host. So the moment we see asylum granting, allowing immigrants into the labor force of various EU countries, and other examples of let's say, family reunification programs, what we're really seeing is a hospitality that has its limits. So it's not an even playing field. Having the status of stranger frequently invites hostile reactions. Another French sociologist I think in the late 19th century, Georges Simmel contended a stranger is not one who comes today and goes tomorrow, but rather is the person who comes today and stays tomorrow. It follows that strangers are always uninvited guests, violating the basis of the host-guest relationship. Because they trespass over the allowed borders of guest status, migrants engender uncertainty and ambivalence by refusing to accept the termination of their allowed period of stay and thereby turning their temporary status into an unexpected permanency. They remain stubbornly and infuriatingly indeterminate. So the explanation for a lot of the European xenophobia today has to do with the dislike of the stranger who has overstayed her or his stay. Immigrants are presented as the persons responsible for the deterioration of security conditions. People in Europe have in mind 9/11 and the Madrid bombings and the London bombings. The terrorism, unemployment, increased public expenditures. This process of stigmatization of the stranger provides a breeding ground for racial and religious discrimination towards Europe's immigrant population. A few words about xenophobia in Eastern Europe. You may wonder whether the same kind of sort of framework applies to the accession states that joined the European Union in 2005 and 2007. It's somewhat different. Xenophobia is linked less to immigration in Eastern Europe than to historical interethnic rivalries and hatreds. One example would be anti-Semitism. Another one would be anti-Roma, anti-Gypsy attitudes. Etienne Balibar, another French writer, has contended that all of Europe suffers from phobias, which is, my sort of working assumption. All of Europe suffers from phobias. It's not a monopoly in the West nor in the East, but right across Europe. These phobias are profoundly buried in the collective unconscious that actually can be traced back centuries and originate in religious and colonial conflicts. For a long time, there was no discernible anti-immigrant bias in the countries of the former Soviet bloc, but at the present time, because there has been an influx of immigrants into Eastern Europe, mostly across the new, let's use the popular term, Iron Curtain, separating EU member states from Russia, Belarus, or Moldova, and so on. Many of the people that now move to Eastern Europe to the EU zone, to the Schengen zone, are Orthodox, and this creates a new type of tension. I want to focus on Islamophobia in France for a while. After the terrorist attacks in the U.S. in 2001, in Madrid, in London, political elites began to make passing and now ever more overt references to the threat posed by Muslim fundamentalists. One 2007 assessment put it very starkly. Europe appears to be crossing an invisible line regarding its Muslim minorities. More people in the political mainstream are arguing that Islam cannot be reconciled with European values. And to repeat, Islam cannot be reconciled with European values. If we're going to talk about political parties, what's happened is a lot of political parties of the center have now adopted this perspective. Before, it was confined to the National Front, to the Lega Nord in Italy, and other right-wing movements. But at the present time, this cordon sanitaire separating the right-wing anti-immigrant attitudes from the moderate centrist, more tolerant attitudes towards immigrants, this cordon sanitaire has been breached, and there is no longer a thick dividing line between the two. You have someone like Pope Benedict XVI who called aspects of Islam evil and inhuman. You have major artistic and theatrical performances that have to be evaluated in terms of whether they are offensive towards Islam or not. So an opera by Mozart, Idomeneo, had to be called off in Germany, its production, because of security fears, since it included a scene showing Muhammad's severed head. So that would make the Danish cartoon crisis seem like a warm beer if you're going to parade the head of Muhammad on stage, even if the music in the background is that of Mozart. So there's a fear of Islamicization in France, but throughout Europe as well. Eurostat predicts significant decreases in the size of the European populations by 2050, but of course the Muslim population reproduction rate is very high. A historian named Walter Lacour explains that in the past it was the naivete of European governments seeking to accommodate the arrival of large numbers of migrant immigrants that was responsible for an Islamophobic backlash. The host governments were quite unaware of the social, cultural, and political consequences of welcoming people whose customs and values were so different from their own. Immigrants who thought their values were superior and would want eventually, as their numbers grew stronger, to impose these values on the host countries. Nor did the Europeans foresee that these ambitions on the part of the immigrants would generate opposition, a backlash, and strengthen radical xenophobic movements across Europe. We can trace anti-Muslim attitudes in Europe back centuries. I wanted to especially single out another French writer named Ernest Renan. He's very well known for his idea of the definition of a nation as a daily plebiscite. That a nation is simply people affirming their identity every single day of their lives. And it seems like a very inclusive and it is almost like a atavistic understanding of nationality and identity. But at a lecture that he gave in Sorbonne in 1883, Renan added to that well-known statement, any person with a bit of education about current affairs clearly discerns the actual inferiority of Muslim countries, the decadence in states that are ruled by Islam, the intellectual nullity of races which behold exclusively their culture and their education to Islam. Very negative from one of the best known and highly reputed students of nationalism and national identity. And we have the same type of thing being repeated over and over again now by right-wing political parties. A lot of the intellectual leaders of Europe also engage in Islam bashing. I don't have time to talk about them, but people like Martin Amis in England and Michel Houellebecq in France and Oriana Fallaci, the late Oriana Fallaci in Italy, and the list goes on. Prominent public intellectuals in Europe have more or less paraphrased Renan in attacking Islam. A little bit about Poland and its phobias in Eastern Europe. I would start off with quoting one of the best known of Polish leaders, Adam Michnik, a prominent figure of heroic proportions on the Polish left. He turned his sights on Poland's nationalistic turn in the last 4 or 5 years. And this is what he writes. Rather than seize on its European Union membership, which Poland got in 2005, to catapult the country forward, Poland's coalition government finds itself looking and moving backward. In a speech to the European Parliament, a politician from one of the Polish coalition parties praised the dictatorships of Salazar in Portugal and Franco of Spain. He also published an open anti-Semitic booklet. During a dry summer, a group of Polish legislatures called upon the parliament to pray for rain. A similar group proposed that the parliament vote to declare Jesus Christ the King of Poland. And so this is what has been happening in Poland, which has led to a kind of a wish to distance the secular EU from this very fundamentalist Roman Catholicism that one finds in Poland and to some extent in Czech Republic and a few of the other countries of Eastern Europe as well. There are times when the Roman Catholics of Eastern Europe make common cause with the Irish and with the Spanish and with the Italians to try to further projects such as including a preamble to the European Constitution recognizing the Christian heritage of Europe. But for the most part, the Polish variant of Catholicism is very unique, and it's odd that internally it doesn't really reflect the far more liberal understanding of Catholicism, the social teachings of Pope John Paul II, who was Polish himself. It took John Paul II's death for the fundamentalism in Polish Catholicism to come out. It couldn't really have taken place during his lifetime because he would have chastised the Polish cardinals and bishops that were responsible for taking such right-wing, sort of transparently anti-Semitic, anti-Orthodox, and anti-secular positions. Michnik added the very interesting comment that Poland's coalition today, and I'm really talking about Kaczynski as president, still at the head of a kind of a right-wing Catholic-inspired movement. The Polish governing coalition today employs a peculiar mix of the conservative rhetoric of George W. Bush and the political practices of Vladimir Putin. If anything qualifies as a characteristic of an outer Europe, as Etienne Barabar calls it, then certainly a combination of W and Putin qualifies. I can go on and on about graphic anti-abortion exhibits put up by Polish parliamentarians in the European Parliament. One showing again, very graphic example of an aborted fetus, and right beside it, you may, of course, be pro-life, but what was wrong was the strategy of putting this particular graphic image right beside a picture of a death camp of Auschwitz, and so to equate abortion to the killing of 6 million Jews was just so provocative. So there is phobia in Eastern Europe. It's less directed at immigrants. There is a strong Russophobia that has obviously historical justifications in Poland, in Lithuania, which just elected a right-wing government, in Latvia and Estonia. It's historically justified because the Russians were the big neighbor that oftentimes and historically imposed their will. But it seems to be chronic and incurable, the Russophobia, and goes beyond a reasoned Russophobia in the way that I would argue Finland has a reasoned Russophobia, refusing, for example, just 2 weeks ago to sign the anti-cluster bomb treaty because the Finns believe that they need cluster bombs to guard its territory from any possible Russian invasion. But the Poles and Czechs and the Estonians and so on seem to have an irrational Russophobia. I'm going to skip ahead and not talk about some of the ethnic hierarchies that are constructed by citizens of Germany and Poland, in which most of the time immigrant groups figure at the very, very bottom. Survey questions oftentimes ask people in Europe, who are your favorite nations? Who would you like your daughter or son to marry? Would it be an Italian or a Turk or an asylum seeker? That's the question that's asked in Germany. And similar questions are asked in Poland. How happy would you be if your son or daughter married someone who wasn't Catholic, someone who was Protestant, someone who was Jewish, someone who was Eastern Orthodox? And the answers do reflect a very serious sort of xenophobia on this very most fundamental of all issues. Who would you like your son or daughter to marry? But it cuts across both countries. So that it's not as if Poland or Germany have an exclusive monopoly on the phobia of some foreign group. A little bit about orthodoxophobia, so that you get a sense of this very kind of poorly known phenomenon that takes place in Europe. For starters, John Paul II in 2001 had to apologize for Roman Catholicism's centuries-old discrimination of orthodoxophobia. He said that Orthodox faithful are brothers and sisters, along with Roman Catholics, and he believed that reconciling the Roman Church with the Byzantine Church would be the crowning achievement of his long papal reign. There are about 1 billion Catholics in the world. There are about 200 million members of Orthodoxy. And the Pope said it was a sin before God and a scandal before the world that this breach between Eastern and Western forms of Christianity had not been breached. So obviously there is recognition at the very top that orthodoxophobia exists. There's a very interesting case study that one could really get into in quite some depth, the role of the Orthodox Church in Russia. And it goes hand in hand with laws discriminating against other religions in Russia. About 70% of Russians now identify themselves as Orthodox. So there has been a major revival of religion in Russia, and it is largely the growing influence of the Orthodox Church, to which Putin himself has staked a lot of his political capital. When he was elected in 2000 as president, one of the first things he did was walk across the Kremlin through Red Square to the Cathedral of the Annunciation, and was blessed by the Metropole of the Russian Orthodox Church, Alexis II, who died just last week. And what's worrying, in addition to anti-immigration sentiments, is discrimination, hatred, phobia, fear, antipathy on the basis of religion, and religions that are not really that much different from each other. So in 1997, there was a law that was passed that began to restrict religious pluralism in Russia, and led to this idea of managed religious pluralism. And more recently, there has been an out-and-out effort to end the so-called invasion of the sects in Russia. A very restrictive law has been passed that limits the autonomy of religious communities in Russia. To be sure, when I traveled to Russia in the mid-1990s, I did find it somehow sort of out of sync that there were sort of religious proselytizers, largely from the southern parts of the United States, that would have trouble proselytizing in Massachusetts or New Orleans or Utah, for that matter, but they were going to Russia and Ukraine to proselytize. These American religious sects were financially pretty well off, and so the Russian Orthodox Church felt a really unfair advantage that these prosperous churches that had absolutely no roots, no history, no tradition whatsoever in Russia were making inroads. And that some Russians and Ukrainians were opportunistic and buying into these proselytizing conversion religions because they had the money and could help someone do well at a time that Russia's economy was a basket case. So the end result is the Orthodox Church has been flexing its muscles under President Putin, and there has been at the same time simultaneously an attack. And I list the religions that the Russians identify as the sects: Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, Evangelicals, Pentecostals, as well as some Methodists. These are, according to one Russian leader, religious groups who cut Christ's robes into shreds like bandits. They are the soldiers who crucified Christ, who ripped apart Christ's holy coat. So pretty inflammatory rhetoric from an Orthodox Russian leader. And so it's no surprise that there's now a backlash against orthodoxy. If this is the way that the Orthodox faith is seeking to regain Russia's and the Russian Orthodoxy's place in the world, it is not surprising that other groups are going to be developing an Orthodoxophobia. That's why I believe that when we talk about anti-immigrant attitudes and anti-foreigner attitudes, if you define someone as foreign by the fact that they're Orthodox, or in the case of Russia, that they're not Orthodox, it shows the magnanimity and the pervasiveness of the phobias that are spreading across Europe, including into Russia. There are only about 2 million Protestants in Russia out of a population of 142 million. But the problem is that most of these so-called sects are tied to the United States. And so the combination of anti-Americanism as well as a kind of a religious form of discrimination against Protestantism combine in Russia and has strongly limited the ability of these churches to have any type of autonomy whatsoever. A word about Romania. Romania has an Orthodox church as well, and there are a group of humanists in Romania who have been attacking the Romanian Orthodox Church. They accuse the Romanian Orthodox Church of collaborating with the communist regime. So that's a serious indictment when you attack the church for being a collaborator of the ancien communist regime. That the Orthodox Church in Romania wants to be a privileged national state church, and some of its social and moral teachings are also condemned. Romanian Orthodox priests have been candidates in Romanian elections, so it's not surprising that in Romania itself there is, on the part of humanists, an attack on orthodoxy. And I could go on. I realize time is running out, so I want to talk about the fact that we have conflict between civilizations that are religiously anchored. Obviously, the most prevalent are between Muslims and non-Muslims. When we look at Huntington, he talks about how there are three different types of civilizational conflicts, really. Core state conflicts, let's say between Russia and the United States. This is a core state conflict. Fault line conflicts between states of different civilizations. So you could talk about some of the situations that have occurred in the 1990s in the Balkans. These are not core states; they are fault line states where there is the meeting of orthodoxy, of Catholicism, of Islam, and leads to conflicts. And then there are fault line conflicts within the states. So some states, like I've just mentioned, Romania, might actually have a fault line conflict within itself. So civilizational conflicts for Huntington are very important, as we know. One study that did quantitative analysis found that only about 38% of all conflicts that have occurred since the Cold War are based on civilizational conflicts of any kind, and the others are largely based on other considerations, based on power or territory, sometimes between indigenous peoples and majority groups. The types of religions that are in particular the targets of secularists in particular are those that first of all, a missionary religion. So at the top of your list of three important criteria to make your religion very likely to be discriminated against in Europe. A missionary religion seeking the conversion of others. Second of all, a universal all-or-nothing religion, in the sense that it's believed by both sides that one's own faith is the correct one. And then there are the teleological religions, where values and beliefs represent the goals of existence, way of life, purpose of human existence. It's those type of religions, and that includes Catholicism, that includes Islam, that end up bringing the wrath of phobias upon them. So, concluding remarks about secularism. There seems to be an overlapping cleavage between Europeans, defined very loosely, and religious groups such as Muslims, Roman Catholics, as in case of Poland, Orthodox faithful. And this cleavage overlaps because it's very similar to the secular versus the religious. If you construct core Europe, old Europe, Brussels Europe, you will find that it really stands for a secular world outlook. And so the European discourse coming out of Brussels is opposed to religions in many respects of any kind other than their own secular kind of cosmology. This in a part of Europe where you actually have official state churches, Sweden and Denmark and England, just to name a few. So it seems hypocritical for Europe to adopt a kind of a secularist world view that immigrants, that anyone from the outside, those that are from outside Europe, the immigrants, those who are from outer Europe, to use Etienne Balabar's term, for outer Europe, such as the Russians, that these groups are being discriminated against. There's been a host of writing about the triumph of secularism in Europe, and the fact that it is now the official, almost unofficial criterion for membership in the EU. If Turkey wants to get into the EU, it can do so only on one basis, and that is to come in as a secularly governed state and not as a religiously based state. And this is an example of how Europe's secularism has won out. I will skip ahead and simply say that this post-secular modernity that core Europe, Western Europe, proclaims is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the sources of the various phobias that Europe has embraced. So I propose, therefore, that a secular Europe, a godless Europe, is inevitably going to be a Europe of fear, of intolerance, and even of hatred towards the strangers. Thank you very much.
We've got a few minutes if you'd like to take a few questions. Please stand up and tell us your name and what you're studying, and go ahead and ask your question. Wait for the microphone so we can back for the podcast.
Hi, Hi, my name is Rebecca. I actually graduated 4 months ago, but I'm an addict to these seminars. I lived in Brussels for about 4 months, and I was curious as to two things. First, what do you think the effect of tourism will be? Do you think there will be a reverberation of this xenophobia on tourism in Europe? And then also, what do you think the new Czech presidency will do for the xenophobia?
Well, I'll start off with the second question and say, well, the Swedes that take over in July 1st, 2009 will have quite a cleanup operation after the Czech president gets through. I think this is a worst case scenario, but a lot of Europeans are fearful that Havel will, since he hasn't even signed. Václav Klaus hasn't even signed the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty yet. And has actually gone to Ireland, urging Irish citizens not to ratify the Lisbon Treaty in the second referendum if one should be held. So he in many ways is Europe's nemesis. He was the one that said at one stage, we don't want the Czech Republic to dissolve in Europe like a sugar cube in a cup of tea. He's the one that argued that Angela Merkel, on the 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, provided him with the document that was issued and signed by all leaders, proclaiming this historic anniversary. Klaus claimed that it wasn't translated into Czech, and when it was, he only had an hour, to sort of reflect on it. So he very much is a Eurosceptic. That's putting it mildly. So I think there's a lot of reasons to worry about what will happen when Václav Klaus becomes the rotating president of Europe between January and July of 2009. As far as tourism is concerned in Europe generally, would you include American tourists in your category? Yeah, okay. The person to answer that question will be Andrei Markovits tomorrow. He's written a wonderful study of anti-Americanism in Europe and the fact that Europeans don't like Americans for a lot of reasons. I remember off the top of my head their constant grin, the fact that they eat so much. We've seen a film called Supersize It, but for Markovits, this is uniquely American to eat 12 to 16 to 24-ounce steaks. The hygiene, the clothes, the list just goes on and on. It's a very visceral dislike. Markovits argues on the part of Europeans towards Americans and especially American tourists. So I think that is going to disappear very quickly because the U.S. has, in the eyes of Europe, a very, very cool president, and very few European countries have a president as cool as the United States has at the present time. It's going to be hard. I speak as a Canadian. I'm embarrassed about who our leader is. And who was responsible for keeping him in power, the representative of the Queen, who prorogued Parliament and allowed Harper to get off the hook from a no-confidence vote. So I think as far as tourism is concerned, it's an interesting topic. I can speak only to the case of American visitors to Europe, and I think there will be a sea change very quickly, and Americans will be treated with great respect and will be applauded. The poor McCain voter goes to Europe and gets applauded by Europeans for having elected a great, cool president.
My name's Jeremy Meek. Outside of the xenophobia that seems to be most prevalent among the political elites of the European Union, are there a certain group of beneficiaries, a certain group of people that have become beneficiaries as a result of immigration, and if so, who is that group?
A very good question. I would start off with the fact that some of the leaders of immigrant groups in Europe are beneficiaries. I think the Turkish organizations in Germany are very well funded. A lot of the leaders of these organizations are actually appointed by a Turkish ministry responsible for religious affairs abroad. and they're financially well endowed. They are, and it's often said that, for example, in the case of women, Turkish women in Germany have fewer rights than Turkish women in Turkey have. Turkish women in Turkey do not have to wear headscarves, quite the contrary, when they're at university. So I think some of the beneficiaries are immigrant leaders, immigrant group leaders. I'm revealing my economic bias by saying that I think corporate Europe benefits from having a lot of immigrants because it does keep wages down. It does take away summer jobs for students, whether it's the case in the United States or in the case of Europe. It's those jobs that immigrants are willing to work for much less money. So I think a lot of the major corporations in Europe are the beneficiaries. I think also that bureaucrats, the bureaucrats in Brussels, because of their kind of embrace of political correctness, are allying themselves with immigrants and arguing together that we are the enlightened people, that these bureaucrats I think are also beneficiaries. And then there are the politicians who simply exploit xenophobia, even though they are not in any way themselves xenophobes. So I would think of someone like President Sarkozy, who is a very enlightened man, a lot of give and take. Everything Sarkozy does involves give and take, although he obviously states his own opinion very strongly. But he sort of very skillfully has exploited French Islamophobia to take him from the Ministry of the Interior to the presidency. So off the top of my head, those would be the groups that I think have benefited from xenophobia.
Drew Meekum, history major. You mentioned Huntington's clash of civilizations theory. I'm not sure if you buy into that completely or not, but my question is, do you see a similar sort of clash between the right and the left in Europe? Is there no reconciliation between the right anti-immigrationists and the left asylumists? What do you see happening with these political perspectives?
I mentioned that there's a lot of research going on right-wing parties. I don't think the future of Europe is in the hands of right-wing parties. I think centrist and left-of-center parties, if they support managed immigration of the kind that is found in this recent European Pact on Immigration and Asylum, signed just a month ago, that is something that would satisfy most left-of-center political leaders. So I think that the right wing is taking a different type of approach to gaining power in Europe. The Austrian elections of about 2 months ago led to the a rise of two now major right-wing parties, but neither of them actually emphasize their anti-immigrant platform anymore. The strength of the right today, in my view, is their anti-European Union rhetoric and not their anti-immigration rhetoric. So in some respects, then, left-center parties, leaders, are picking up on European citizens' mild xenophobia and saying it's time for managed immigration policy. We've signed the pact. European Union countries will work together now to make sure that Europe absorbs the type of immigrants. The key phrase is with dignity, with dignity. Europe will absorb immigrants if they can absorb immigrants with dignity. And it reflects their carrying capacity. So that's the position of the left, whereas the right wing isn't getting any more mileage, I think, with the exception maybe of the Swiss party that I referred to. But they're really not getting very much mileage anymore with their immigration bashing. And it's the European Union bashing that has stood them well in most recent elections. Yes?
It seems to me, It seems to me that some of the rhetoric about the inclusion of immigrants has moved from purely religious grounds to grounds that are more acceptable to a secular society. So, for example, we see in Great Britain the new Forced Marriage Act that cracks down on insincere consent in marriage. We see the Muslim community in the UK drafting a new Muslim marriage contract that explicitly gives women the right to divorce on a par with men. In other words, bringing family law practices of Muslims in line with more secular understanding. So I think there are some issues that will probably be non-negotiable to the left, including these gender issues. So, for example, in a study I recently did with another of my colleagues here at BYU, Donnelly Bowen, we were able to show that countries that allowed family law enclaves of Sharia law or Hindu law that do not give equitable rights to women, that they had those countries had significantly higher levels of violence against women compared to European nations where such enclaves were not allowed. So I think the debate may be moving from religion versus religion to issues like gender practices, family law enclaves, and so forth.
If I understand you correctly, therefore, if you adopt Sharia law, like Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan has suggested, on civil issues like marriage, that on the one hand, women will get more rights out of it. If you create an enclave of Sharia law,
that if you create an enclave of Sharia law, you can expect to see levels of violence against women rise in society.
Right. So as in the case, my area of specialization is Russia, the Soviet Union. So in the 1920s, there was this very poignant sort of dilemma of women actually being unveiled by Soviet commissars. And the end result in this effort to emancipate women in the early years of the Soviet Union was they were stoned by men. So are you suggesting this is... not to the same extreme, but this is that same kind of dynamic at work?
What I'm suggesting is that family law is actually a crucial battleground in the immigration issue, right? It's not so much whether you pray in the direction of Mecca 5 times a day, but it's issues of family law, personal status law, that may be more of the thorn in the side of Western societies. And that we can now actually show that allowing enclaves, as Rowan Williams has suggested, we can demonstrate that does in fact lead to heightened violence against women in these societies.
In the enclaves or in the societies?
In the societies, in both. Obviously, as a result of the increasing violence in the enclaves, you see a spillover effect into the larger society.
Are these religious leaders who are sort of perpetrating directly or indirectly the violence against women because women or
It's the perpetuation of assumptions about inequitable status of women versus men under family law and personal status law. And we've seen nations like the UK, Sweden, and others cracking down specifically in the area of family law while leaving other Muslim religious practices untouched. It is really family law where the battleground has moved now.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's I can understand why family law becomes, to me it's far more important, those issues of, power and influence and status within the marriage, for example, than to me a diversionary kind of issue is that sort of veil headscarf issue. There's been so much research on the headscarf in France. And that is not really about power. And in fact, quite the contrary. Oftentimes, if we allow for this particular cultural practice, what Canadians would call, or Quebecers would call, reasonable accommodation, it is in a sense to recognize the kind of the inferior status of women by doing just that. An example would be the decision on the part of the Council of State in France about 3 months ago to deny citizenship to a woman who was wearing not a headscarf, burqa. And so the Council of State announced that this wearing of the burqa is contrary to the Republican values of the country, and she would not get status. And one of the other interpretations that the Council of State offered was that this really can be construed as nothing else except the kind of the subordination of the woman. There can be no other circumstances under which a woman, this is what the French Council of State said, would voluntarily choose to wear the burqa. And this is a particular form of Islam, Salafism, in which it is a traditional hierarchy, a traditional patriarchal structure. So I'm basically showing an exception to my kind of principle that the headscarf issue is diverting us from the real issues of power. Recognition is one thing. Empowerment, especially of women in such religions, is far more important. We should never, ever get distracted by issues of mere recognition when you're ceding power in the process.